Welcome to another episode of the Steeple Report. Today's guest is Reverend Larry Turner from the Memphis area. What specific town was it?
It's Bartlett, Tennessee, but it's a suburb of Memphis.
Right. So Larry has a very interesting background, not only as a pastor, but has studied undergrad in psychology and then postgrad in counseling and related areas. And so we're going to talk about some interesting topics to do with the life of pastors, the life of everyday Christians, and in this crazy world we find ourselves in. And so welcome.
Thank you. I was glad to be with you today.
Yeah. And so just so the viewers can kind of get a picture of you, why don't you give us a insight into where you came from and your education, that kind of thing.
Certainly. Well, I've been a pastor for 25 years, been in ministry for about 35 in various capacities. I grew up in a little town in Alabama called Decatur, Alabama, in North Alabama. Moved to Memphis in 1979. I felt the calling to ministry when I was about 18 years old. And I'd come to Christ at before my 17th birthday. And it was a really profound time in my life. I mean, I really sensed the presence of the Lord there. There was a change that was significant and substantive, and I understood that. And so I had this call on my life. And I was very shy growing up. I didn't like to be in front of people other than on the ball field. That was about it. I didn't want to talk in front of folks and that sort of thing. And so I really ran from the call and finally moved to Memphis in 1979 because I felt like I needed to get education. And so I started out at what was then called Mid-South Bible College. I met my wife 2 years into that and realized I'd really rather be a wife. I mean, really rather have a wife than a college degree.
That would have been different.
Yeah. So we were married in 1982 and had our two children, our two sons. And then in 1987 or end of 86, the company I was with, they were reorganizing. And so I got reorganized out. And that started me back on the educational process. And so I started back to then Crichton College. It was a Christian liberal arts school in Memphis. Went there for another 2 years, finished up my undergrad work, went to the University of Memphis and earned a master's degree in counseling. Thought that I was going to be doing counseling. That really suited my personality a lot better than being in front of people preaching and that sort of thing. I really love to teach. I love the one-on-one. I love to sit down and help people through whatever they were going through. But I was at a church in Memphis. It was called Covenant Presbyterian Church. And I was the youth director. And because of that, I preached every Sunday night in the Vesper service and led the youth. And I led a Wednesday night Bible study for the adults. It was ironically, I didn't do youth except on Sunday night. Everything else was with adults. And they began to talk to me in the latter part of 1992, earlier part of 93 about going to seminary. And I never really had considered it. It just wasn't on my radar. Number one, it'd been in a Presbyterian church, and to be a Presbyterian minister, you had to learn Hebrew and Greek. I struggled with English, and I hated to read, and I didn't want any part of it. But as I prayed about it, and as my wife and I talked about it, and the church continued to sort of reinforce that, we went to Richmond, Virginia, to Union Theological Seminary and visited it was Memorial Day of 1993. And 6 weeks later, we moved to Richmond and started seminary in July of 93 and made it through all the stuff and graduated in 96 with my Master's of Divinity.
Well, and you're skipping over the tragic part of those years, though.
What's that?
The misfortune of studying with Frank Webster.
Well, block out bad memories. It's
Sometimes
better.
that's healthy to do.
That's right. I don't know if it's denial or whatever it is, but no, Frank and I, we became close friends right away. And really when, after language,
I'm going to get a punch in the arm for that one. So,
I'm going to try to redeem you though. I'm going to try to do that. But so and we all went there in July of 93 to start Greek school. And that was an intensive Greek for 8 weeks. And we did that. And during that time, Frank and I became good friends and some others in our class. Well, then in the fall, during a regular semester, we found out they had each year, either first, second, or third years, had a football team. We played flag football. Well, when we found that out, Frank and I loved football, and so I was the quarterback. And I have to say one thing about Frank. I could be 5 feet from him and throw it as hard as I could, which I did a few times, and he caught it every time. He had bruises on his chest, but he caught it. He was my most dependable receiver. He wasn't the fastest, but he could catch.
And that's pretty good because he was a lineman when he was actually playing the real game.
Yeah, see, he should have been a tight end. They just misappropriated his talents, or he would have gone to the NFL. But they didn't, and it was my good fortune that at seminary we won a lot of games because he could catch.
Good to have that connection.
Yeah, I wish he could have had something else to fall back on, but But so we moved from Richmond in 93 after graduation and started pastoring a church down in Alexander City, Alabama. A little small town. If you've heard of Russell Athletics, it was where they were headquartered. And so it was the first Presbyterian church there. I grew up in the Baptist church. So being a Presbyterian, I'd only been one really 6 years at best or most. And so I didn't really understand the workings of the Presbyterian church, even though I'd gone through polity classes and seminary and all of that. But going into that church, it was a wonderful experience. Some of the best people I'd ever met. My first week there, I had a lady, she was in her 80s, and she turned out to be my right arm. I mean, she came in and said, anything you need me to do, I'll do it. And we ended up going to lunch about once a week, and we would go visiting folks, and she was just a sweetheart of a lady. And then from there, after 7 years there, went to Oakmont Presbyterian Church in Birmingham, or Hoover, Alabama. Stayed there 4 years. And I hate to say it, but I really was bored at that church. The church was good folks once again, but really had no outward focus, really had nothing, didn't want to do anything that would draw people in. And so got bored with that, and then was looking around one day on the Presbyterian website, and I saw that there was a church open in Bartlett, Tennessee, and my wife is from Memphis, and her whole family's here almost. And so I applied, sent them at that time it's called a PIF, a personal information form, and got the look. We interviewed and ended up taking that position in 2008. Then I got really fed up with Presbyterian politics and the church being about the denomination rather than about Jesus, and decided that I've had enough. And in 2012, I walked away for a day. And I resigned on a Sunday after a lot of things had happened. That Monday, I had a couple in the church, or really that Sunday after I resigned, I had a couple in the church wanted to take me and my wife to lunch or dinner the next night, and they did. And they asked me what I was going to do, and they wanted to know if I had a church or if we were moving. And my wife was the director of the Women's Health Center at Baptist Hospital Corporation, and so she had a great job, and no reason for us to leave that and her family here. And so I told them, no, I don't have any plans. I said, there's a Lowe's right down the street from our house. I think I can apply. I can get a job. And he said, there's a group of folks that are leaving that church that I was pastoring, and they want to start a church, but they don't want to do it unless I would be their pastor. And so on St. Patrick's Day of 2012, we had our first organizational meeting to see if it was going to be possible. We had about 55 folks said they wanted to do it. And in 2 weeks, the first Sunday of April of 2012, we began our journey at Harmony Church of Bartlett, which is a non-denominational church. It's a church for the hurting, for people who've been hurt by the church, because we all had kind of one of our slogans is ordinary people, extraordinary God. We're a grace church. that means we're a new covenant. I preach and teach that in Christ, salvation is in him alone, that we have everything we need because of what he did for us. It's not our works, it's his. And we trust in him. And for now, it'll be 9 years this coming Sunday. Actually, it's April 1st was our first service, but this coming Sunday would be our 9th anniversary of our first service.
Wow, that's terrific. A little luck of the Irish got you there, huh?
It got me. It really did. And, I was at that time, I'm 63. So at that time, 64, I had no desire to do a church plant. I talked to a bunch of guys who had started churches, and I saw the energy they had, and I realized most of them are in their 20s and 30s and early 40s. And I'm like, I'm not that. I don't have the energy to do it. I've never done it. I don't know how to do it. But we had such a good core group. And that core group now we've doubled out of that. And so our core group now is the minority of the people at the church. But it was so easy. The transition was so easy. And we started out gangbusters. We already had our focus. Our theology is, as I said, is new covenant. It's love as Jesus loves you, and God will take care of the rest. And that's what we do. We're an outwardly focused congregation, and that's where we want to stay.
It reminds me, your combination of the Presbyterian, Baptist, and then non-denominational. I was actually with Frank Webster, and he was guest preaching, and to his surprise, in a Presbyterian church, they actually started clapping, and actually showing a little bit of emotion, and he called it the Presticostal. But so with your background with counseling, one of the things I wanted to talk about, you shared some of the emotions that you went through in your different churches, and so I had been talking to different people, and then I actually did some research, and I pulled a few just stats that can get us talking. And 40% of pastors have considered leaving the ministry in the last 3 months. Over half of pastors who start out in ministry will not last past 5 years. Over 70% of pastors experience loneliness and have no close friends that they can trust with personal matters. And the last one is 70% have a lower self-image now than when they first joined the ministry.
Wow.
Those things just jumped out at me as, there's thousands of statistics, but there's this isolation that happens for pastors. I've had some discussions with others that, some go into it with this idea that they can't be too close to their parishioners. They have to have that separation so that they can have objectivity and be a faithful leader. And others say, well, you can never be close enough. I don't know that anybody's figured out the right equation, but there is that also that part of being a pastor that, by the nature of it as a position, people look up to it. And then the pastor takes upon himself having to be on 24/7, and that even extends to his family, where if they're out in a smaller town or what have you, and they're going to be recognized, that can be draining, that can be stressful, but it all goes back to kind of my main thesis of this isolation and perpetuating of loneliness. And so I wanted to kind of dig in with you, maybe you're not counseling pastors specifically, but, from a psychological and counseling point of view, wanted to get your thoughts and maybe, some advice that you might want to extend to those that are feeling these feelings.
Yeah, and those feelings are real. I've experienced everything that you mentioned there. And one of the things about it is, in some ways, it is self-inflicted because we do put our guards up. And as long as I've been doing it, I still put mine up just because of things that have happened. And because people put the pastor on the pedestal, people want to be your friend. They want to, especially, well, coming from the Presbyterian church, if you're at like my first church, it was the first Presbyterian church of that town. And that was kind of a prestigious pastorate. So people put you on the pedestal, and they were quick to look for ways to knock you off. And so when you're in a situation like that, where you're constantly on guard, you really have to find avenues to let your hair down, to just be yourself, to vent. And God put a man in my life. His name's Wayne Cowhick, and he came to Alexander City a year after I started, and he was at a independent Methodist church, and it was his first pastorate. He had been bivocational. He was a truck driver and was pastoring part-time, and then they called him as a full-time pastor. Well, we met at a pastor's meeting about a year after I started, and right as he started, and he was just learning to play golf, and I'd been playing golf all my life, and we started playing golf, and he and I, we would probably play 1 or 2 days a week.
Our next interview will be in person, and we will be playing golf. So just as an aside.
And so what we started doing was just getting out of town. And we had this one particular course that was about 15 miles away. They actually had 2 courses, and they would let us play for the price of one. And we would play 18 holes in the morning, have lunch, go play 18 holes in the afternoon at the other course. And we would do that almost every week as long as weather permitted. And we were constantly talking. And so we had a confidant in each other. And he and I are still very close, and we talk all the time now. But if you don't have somebody like that, that sense of loneliness can really creep in, because when you feel like you've got to be perfect, you can't slip up and say something wrong. You've got to be on your P's and Q's all the time. You can't really relax and act like yourself. They know where you live. We would have parishioners going slowly by our house, just to see what the pastor's up to. And so, you always feel like that. You feel like your kids are in a fishbowl, and that's not good when you have, a 6th grader and an 8th grader, and they're getting
a preacher's kid. So I saw that firsthand.
Yeah. And so they couldn't be themselves. They were always looked on as something else. They couldn't just be normal kids, and mine were very normal. And so, I would get the looks. Thankfully, I had a police lieutenant or detective in our church, and he would let me know if things were going to happen and I needed to get my son out of there. That happened a few times. But the sense of isolation, and that's really what I felt when we came back to Memphis and started having a rough patch in that church. And the feelings of abandonment that I felt from parishioners and elders. I had one elder tell me that she loved me, but she was going to do whatever she had to do to get her way. Mm. And I'd never heard that coming from church people. I'd been through a church split when I was a child, but, I wasn't involved in the politics of all that. And I didn't have any idea that she was serious. And the things that she did hurt me. And I moved it to this day. I mean, I still carry the scars. And it was hard for me to trust people again after that. But I found that I have to do it. Now, I'm not as open with every member of my church as I am with some, but it's like anybody. We all have people that we feel closer to, sure, and we're going to open up more to. Other people we don't feel quite as close to. We're going to love them. We're going to be there for them if they need us. We'll talk to them, laugh with them, have meals with them, but we're just not going to let ourselves be opened up to them. And so being a pastor, you've got to do that too. You've got to recognize, one, that you're just a human being, and God calls imperfect people to do his work, that you've got to have a close confidant, at least one, somebody you can talk to besides your spouse. You don't need your spouse having to hear all of the stuff you need to spew, because you need to protect them a little bit. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I've got a friend of mine. He and I were roommates in college back in 1979, and we've been good friends ever since. And his life has taken a lot of turns, but we talk every week, and he's like, Larry, if you ever need me to cuss for you, just let me know. Tell me what's going on, and I'll do it. And he does. And his name's Dale. I said, all right, Dale, man, it's been rough and this is what's going on. And he'll just take off. And I'm like, all right, appreciate it. I feel better.
It's not as fun as screaming into a pillow, right?
It's fun. Not near. I live vicariously through him. I think that's what we've got to learn to laugh, not take ourselves so seriously.
Yeah.
We're all going to make mistakes. If you can't laugh at yourself, I mean, you're not going to survive. Don't try to be perfect in everything you do. Don't try to preach the perfect sermon, try to be the perfect counselor, try to be the perfect anything. For me, it came down to not trying to do it myself, but trusting in Jesus. Because I recognize I have so many flaws and I have so many things that I have to deal with. And so if I can trust everything to him, then that frees me up to just love people like he loves me. And then I'm not having to be perfect all the time. And I can admit the mistakes. I can say, well, I'm, sorry. If you've never made a mistake. Okay.
Yeah, there's one expression that I hear that I kind of like. It's how does it go? It's don't compare yourselves to others. Compare yourself to yourself yesterday and try to be better, because we can only do what we can do. We are flawed. We do have our, traps that we set for ourselves, and, we could try to get better. And that's, the best we could do. We could trust in the Lord that, he'll guide us forward. But going back to one thing you said about one of your parishioners wanting her way, it's interesting. I was talking to a pastor, and he comes from a denomination where their policy, not polity, is basically to move around pastors like every 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
And he heard very early on from several people that were multi-generational members of that church, look, pal, this is our church. You're only here for a season. So don't go trying to change things. We like it just the way it is. And, it was a lesson he had to really learn.
Yeah, they're going to outlast you. They're not going to, they know you're going to come and go. Pastors come and go because they've been through it so long. And and that's the hard part too, because then your hands are tied ministry wise. And you don't want to just like kowtow to the powerful, but you also got to do what you believe God has called you to do. Mm-hmm. And that's such a hard thing. But I want to go back on something you said too. Steve Brown is one of my favorite authors and speakers. And I love what he said. He says, even if we don't get any better, God still loves us. Mm. And I take great solace in that, because I can't make myself better sometimes. Most of the time I can't. I've got to depend on the Holy Spirit to do his work in me. And if I don't get any better, it's not going to change the way God sees me, because he loves me completely.
He already knows your flaws. So,
it's his fault, right?
Yeah, we'll blame him. But, I always say to people, that the people that wallow in their in their failures, and I always say, you can look at it a bunch of different ways, that all you're doing is beating yourself up. I look at it this way, kind of like what you said, is God sees me, he knows my flaws, he accepts me as I am. And I look at it this way, the more I improve myself, the more he recognizes that effort and rejoices in it with me, that I'm becoming a better child of the Lord. So, that's all we can do is keep on trying, and
he's got such a great sense of humor.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are a lot of times I'll say something, he's just shaking his head. I can't believe you said that. But that's the thing. When we become comfortable and confident in him, with who we are, that he's never going to let us go, nothing can separate us from him, and all of that, then that gives us the confidence that we need to minister to the people, even if they're trying to control us, no matter what they're trying to do, no matter what the circumstances are, because we know he's bigger than all of that, and that he's got us. And so that gives me the freedom to make mistakes. I don't want to make a mistake. I want to be perfect like everybody else, but it gives me the freedom to make those mistakes. But it gives me the freedom to say, well, all right, I blew that one, so let's move on to the next one.
Right. I want to go way back to something you said earlier because it just reoccurred to me. This is getting a little bit out of the counseling part and more into the churchy part. So you had said this, the last church you were in Alabama, they had no interest in looking outside the walls of their church, and it's so funny that, within the evangelical community, that it seems that not everybody, excuse me, many people focus on the salvation part of the message, that, it's through faith in him that we go to heaven, but they forget about the works part, which is not to get to heaven, but it's an outcropping of our faith, that we recognize, as Frank and I often say, the imago Dei in our fellow man, and we're compelled through our faith to do those works to lift others up. It has nothing to do with trying to buy our way into heaven. It's nothing to do with that. And I think sometimes those messages, the salvation part is leaned on very strongly, but then some churches just, I don't know how they miss it, that that part of our faith should be to love all the other children of God, and the ones that haven't arrived yet, that we need to try to lift up and try to help them get there.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, I think that's for like my whole philosophy in life is what Paul said in Colossians. He said, Jesus is your life. He's not number one or number two. He is. So whatever you are, he is there with you. Also, we love as he loved us, which is that Maundy Thursday message coming up this Thursday, is that when he was leaving his disciples, he said, a new command I give you. And that command supersedes everything. Because if we love people as he loves us, then we're not going to sin against them. We're not going to intentionally harm them. We're not going to steal their stuff. All of the things that, let's say, the law tells us to do, we don't have to depend on it. We depend on the spirit that lives within us. And so, I'm just called to love people. And I try to stay in that lane. That's hard enough from time to time. People say, well, like our church is very diverse. We've got people, all backgrounds, we have alphabet church, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
Well, I saw. And people are like, well, but why do you let those people come? And I said, why wouldn't I? They need Jesus as much as I do. Right. They need to show the love of Christ instead of a finger pointed in their face saying, you're going to hell. So I prefer the message of grace over the message of judgment, because that's my responsibility. Everything else is on Jesus. That's his business. And so I don't want to do his work. I want to do the work he's given me to do. And that is to love people as he loved me.
Yeah, I mean, when people are kind of missing that part, I just kind of remind them, hey, remember that thing they call the greatest commandment? Had a lot to do with loving thy neighbor. And, so that was not something, that was just a throwaway. That was love thy God and love thy neighbor, so those were two biggies for him. And I think we need to take those with equal weight. And
he said, don't love them if they do something.
No, right. It's not qualified. Right.
Yeah. So we put qualifiers on things. I don't put qualifiers on who I love anymore. I just can't do it. Not only that, it's just too hard to keep up with. If I've got 10 things you've got to meet up with or match up to before I'll give you the time of day or really invest in your life, well, I got to keep up with that. And I don't like that. I like life simple. Love Jesus, love people, and then everything else takes care of itself. And then I can put my head at night and sleep.
And we had so many lessons throughout the Bible. There's the cast the first stone. That who am I to be judgmental? I mean, I'm a flawed human being myself, and I'm being disingenuous to. I mean, their weakness might be my strength, but my weakness might be their strength. So you don't know that. So, to criticize others frivolously is arrogant, and it's dismissive, and it's just not Christian. I mean, it's just against the teachings.
Yeah, I agree completely.
I mean, just to kind of stay on this idea of isolation and loneliness, I have a few books back here by Barna that, they've done a lot of studies as of late on Gen Y and Gen Z. And the numbers are downright depressing. It's like 1 in 3 don't feel that they have somebody in their life who cares about them. And I think it's 25 or 30%, don't feel that they have something important in their life that defines, their life, or gives them hope for their future. I mean, there's just a lot of, and that was a big study. I think it was something like 15,000 kids between 18 and 35 in like 15 countries. I mean, it was broad. And
Yeah.
It's exacerbated, because you think about when a lot of these kids were born, they were born in the smartphone generation, as many people call it, and so the smartphone, texting, and social media has an isolating effect as it is. And now we throw in on COVID,
Right.
and isolating them for over a year in many cases, but what's interesting about these studies is that, when you look at kids that are brought up in a regular attending of I think they call it a conservative Christian church, something to that effect in the wording, those numbers go down. They really improve.
Right.
When I say go down, I mean more kids feel a sense of connection and purpose.
Mhm.
Do you counsel a lot of youth in your?
No, not a lot. There are a few. Got several in our church. Tend to be doing okay though, because they're out and about. Most of the ones that I deal with would be college age,
Mhm.
and they seem to be doing okay from that perspective. But one of the things, if we're just going to talk statistics, is that 23% of the Gen Z, or one of them, they have no religious or spiritual
Yeah.
affiliation whatsoever.
The nuns.
They don't.
Yeah.
The
NES. Yes.
Yeah, they see no need for it, and that's the largest. I'm gonna use a term, and you'll understand what I mean. The largest religious group are the nuns. The next are the evangelical Christians, and the next are the Roman Catholics. And so that's a huge group. That's about 70 million people in our country today that have no religious affiliation and don't seem to want any. And that's a bigger question that we have to look at, is why is that the case? And of course, it's not the focus of our topic today, but I think that would be a good study to look at and see why they feel that way. And I think it's the church's fault. I'm not going to fault the kids. I'm going to fault those who are leading them, or who are showing them the example and that sort of thing. But one of the things that I'm really trying to get my mind wrapped around now, because I'm a baby boomer, I knew what a rotary phone was. I thought the touch tone was the greatest thing ever.
I remember when my TV remote had a cord on it. So and I remember when I was the one who had to get up and change the channel. So
yeah, that was great when you had kids and you could make them do it.
yeah.
But we remember the lack of technology. I remember my first computer had a big floppy drive, you had to put in.
The Tandy from Radio Shack.
Yeah, well, and it was with a cassette tape. I don't know if you remember those. Yep. It had a cassette tape. And but the thing that I'm trying to wrap my mind around with these kids today is all they know is technology. Yeah. They've had smartphones their whole life. They've had computers. They've got all the social media. And I saw a cartoon, or I don't know if it's a cartoon, but it was something. It was like 6 kids were sitting around a table, like a dining room table or a restaurant table, and every one of them was on their phone texting. And the caption was, "They're alone together."
Right.
And I look at that as, that's so horrible.
Yeah.
But if you've grown up in a generation that hasn't known anything else,
yeah,
how horrible is it? And to put a label of horrible on it, from my perspective, is to, in a way, be dismissive of it, because it's like I'm going to try to pull them back into my generation and get them to understand from my perspective, when the onus is on me to understand from their perspective. It would be like when we grew up, our parents had cars. Well, my great grandparents or my grandparents didn't have a car. They had a horse and buggy. So it'd be like them trying to make me come back and ride in their horse and buggy to get to where I was going, or to not have indoor plumbing like they didn't have, or a shower, when all I've known is that sort of thing. And so what we have to do is let them pull us forward instead of trying to pull them back. And that's where the tension comes in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if there is a silver lining to this whole COVID thing, it's going to have a lot of detrimental effects, in terms of traditional churches and the ones that were teetering to begin with. But if we can look at any silver linings, I think one of them will be that the technological prowess of many congregations has exponentially increased. And so they're out on the web doing services and doing social media and doing all sorts of things that they never did before. So the chances of connecting with, others outside of their building, could increase. And so, there's hope there.
If you think about it, and this is a broad statement, but if you think about it, more people in the history of the planet can hear the gospel every day than ever in history.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a phenomenal thing. When you got almost 8 billion people on the planet, and almost every one of them have technology in some form or fashion. And I've been in Brazil where people had nothing, but they got a phone. They could hook up to a Wi-Fi somewhere, and people are hearing the gospel like never before. And so, as you say, the silver lining to this dark cloud is that technology is allowing churches like mine. We never did have a presence on Facebook or live streaming until it happened. And that was fraught with a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth too, because I didn't want to do it, but we had to do it, but one of the things that I see a lot of the despair coming in, especially with COVID and technology, or what's happening to our young people and a lot of people in general, the sense of despair and aloneness they feel. It's not, I think, because they're into technology, it's that they cannot choose to have the physical contact.
Well,
you know what I'm saying?
Even adults. I mean, I feel that because I get comfort in corporate prayer and being with my church family. And so I think that affects people, I think, of all generations, that we are social people, period.
Right. And I think when you isolate kids by not allowing them to go to school, you don't allow them to participate in sports, you don't allow them to do the normal life, even though they still have the social media, that's like drinking water for them. Okay, they're going to have that no matter what. But it's when you say you can't have the physical connection with other human beings, to literally touch and see and hear, all that with our senses, then that's where that sense of despair comes in. And I fought that. Well, I fought that hard when it happened, and they were like, 2 weeks to slow the curve or flatten the curve thing, Well, we did 2 weeks and nothing got flattened, and the hill got bigger. And I just decided at that point I was going to let my faith override any fear that I have. I would wear a mask, I would distance, I would do all that, but I was going to have social connection. And in fact, our church decided we were going to have live worship regardless. And we did. Now, we might only have 15 or 20 or 30 people there, but we needed that connection. I mean, I saw my grandson several times a week. I saw my kids. We still tried to interact as best we could with being smart. And, thankfully, everything's worked out. But we've got to have it. We're made for it, like you said. We are not made to be isolated people.
Yeah, I think the only downside, which is just part of the internet and social media, is that as it's kind of an open pipeline of ideas, and what you notice on Facebook and all of the other social media is that it's given the same platform to the conspiracy theorist as it has the most reasoned person with all the facts and figures. And so it takes a special discernment to separate fact and fiction and truth. And so putting that in the church context, we have enough bad theology out there, and so I don't know if it's a necessary concern, but it is a concern that I have, is that the wrong message, the wrong kind of theology, the prosperity gospel, and all those kinds of things will be louder than a true adherence to the book.
Yeah, and they will be louder. I mean, it's just the nature of the beast, because people want what they want. They want to be told that they can, they can have all the wealth they want. They cannot have to worry about sickness. They can be skinny. They can, whatever it is. And there are those that are out there doing that. But this is where I go with that, is I can't control what's on the internet. I can only control the content that I put on it. And so if I feel like I'm preaching the gospel, the simplicity of the gospel, the trueness of the gospel, the greatness of the gospel, then I can't worry about all the other things. And that was going to happen whether there was COVID or not. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it was already a cesspool of all kinds of stuff before COVID ever hit. And it's going to be that way, because, how do you regulate it? Well, I know how they're trying to regulate it, which is to shut us up. Yeah. But be that as it may, we have to simply be true to who we are and the calling that God has placed on us. Yeah. And hopefully people will come to us and say, this is what I read. What do you think about that?
Right.
And then we can maybe add some corrective to whatever it is that they've been led astray on.
Yeah. I mean, you had said that, the church bears some responsibility for the kids losing touch with the church, but there are other forces at work too. It was interesting. I heard some psychologist being interviewed. He said the absolute worst thing that the last couple generations have been taught is you're okay just the way you are. It was this idea that they were just fine and anything they did was perfect, and you don't have to improve. God loves you just right. It doesn't kind of work that way, in terms of understanding our flaws and trying to live up to the expectation of Christ. And so it was an interesting discussion that he was like, that is the single worst teaching that has been force-fed into the last couple of generations, is because there's no accountability if you're just fine the way you are.
Well, I like what Max Lucado said. He said, God loves you just the way you are, but he loves you too much to leave you that way. And that's the great thing. But see, going back a little further in our discussion, that's the sort of the flip side of the coin. God loves us just the way we are. He redeems us the way he doesn't ask us to clean up our act before he'll save us. The blood of Christ was sufficient for every human being who's ever lived if they'll simply trust him. Yeah. And then he washes us new, fills us with the Holy Spirit, gives us a clean heart, a pure heart. God doesn't sit in the swivel chair, turn his back on us when we sin. He's always facing us. His Spirit is in it. God is always in us, so he goes with us wherever we go. And if we recognize that, and as I said earlier, Jesus is our life, then we begin to depend upon him. And it's kind of like the seed that's planted. Some falls on the stony ground, some whatever, but there's some that go deep in and it grows up. All right. Well, you and I, we can't cause ourselves to grow up. It's a work of the Holy Spirit. But what we have to do is to have the soul of our hearts and our minds renewed, and so that we can hear, we can listen, and then be obedient to what he's telling us.
Yeah,
and that's where I think
the fertile ground. Yeah.
That's right. And that's where I see as a pastor, my responsibility is to keep that ground fertile for the people that hear the message that I give them, so that the Holy Spirit can work into it. So it can't be judgment, because that hardens the ground, but it's got to be soft so they can hear it. And then I like to let God do his work in people's lives and encourage and support and counsel and do all of those things to help them to be nurtured in the faith. Mm-hmm. And that's where, if we go back, I don't know, what year were you born, if you don't mind me asking? 62. Okay, well, I was born in 57. And I grew up in an era when, and this is why I said the church bears the brunt of the responsibility for the generations coming up who have a lack of faith or desire of it. My dad was a deacon in the church, and I love my dad dearly, but my dad was one way on Sunday or during church and on the way all around church. But then after that, he was a totally different way that was not Christ-like, very harsh, very, okay. So you grow up in the 40s, 50s, maybe 50s, I don't know. You have this idyllic view of life, and everybody goes to church. And when I was in school, everybody went to church. And in fact, we got asked on Monday morning, did you go to Sunday school and church? And I wasn't about to miss church because I didn't want to have to say, no, I didn't go. You know, we raise our hands.
Right.
And so it became sort of a social thing rather than a spiritual thing.
Yeah.
Well, the 60s hit. And then, you know, we know what happened in the 60s, right? Every system and thing in our society got turned upside down, and for good reason. And so then people started turning away from the church, and then you had the hippie movement, all the stuff in California and all that. Well, then our generation began to make that turn in their teenage years of saying, I don't want something that's not real. And so they started staying away from church because they saw church people not being consistent. And then that kind of trickled down, almost like a waterfall effect,
right.
Happened in our culture. And so then the baby boomers quit going because they didn't want to. They didn't send their kids, or they might have sent the kids, but they didn't go. So the kids saw the hypocrisy. And then, you know, you see how it just kind of perpetuates it to where now, I think in many respects, we're at the best place we could be because the mission field is so wide open to hear the gospel. Yeah. People don't want to hear church. They don't want to hear, you know, how great you are. They want to know what Jesus means to you.
But truth never gets old, right?
It does not get old because we can lay all the church baggage aside. And that's why I'll never be part of a denomination, because I don't want to have to toe a party line. I don't want to have to push a certain theological perspective. I want to be able to preach the simplicity of the gospel and let people understand it that way. And to recognize that Jesus is more than just a slogan. You know, Jesus is your life. He wants every aspect of your life, and he wants you to be in obedience to that and live from that, not from, you know, I went to church, so I check a box.
Yeah, it was interesting for me. I mean, my religious background is a long and winding road. So I grew up Catholic. My mom, before she met my dad, my mom actually was in the convent studying to be a nun, and that's N-U-N. And you don't study to be the other kind of nun. And you know, decided, you know, that's just not the calling that's, you know, for her life. But you know, she remained very devout her whole life, and so we kids, you know, all went to church. You know, I went to Catholic summer camp, and I was an altar boy, and, you know, did the whole thing. And you know, as happens to many, but oh, before I go there, and then my father, even with that, you know, strict Catholic kind of part of my mom, she marries an Episcopalian. So that was kind of controversial back in the 50s. But you know, he had faith. It was not on his sleeve. I think sometimes he went to church more because he was a wonderful singer and loved to sing with other people. But he did believe. But it wasn't really pushed on us, you know, after a certain age. And as happens to a lot of kids, you know, I kind of put it on a back burner through college, and you know, fell into that. But I came back to it because there was that missing part of me. Like, you know, there was something missing. And, you know, I went through a divorce, which made me kind of question what was going on inside of me, you know, and, you know, what was I not doing right? You know, so you go through that introspection, and, you know, but if you're never exposed to it, which a lot of the kids these days, because a lot of their parents have fallen away, so the kids aren't even getting the opportunity to grow up for even a few years. The chances of them going for the first time, you know, as opposed to me going back,
Mhm.
I ended up a non-denominational Christian in the end. And actually, Frank, I asked him, and he with my pastor were both with me and baptized me together in the Atlantic Ocean, which was kind of a special day. Which is, I guess, controversial. You can't be baptized twice. So it was ceremonial, but for me, it was important.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I made a public declaration when I was in swaddling clothes and getting it dripped on my forehead. So, but I think to your point, if the parents fall away, what are the chances their kids are going to come to it on their own when they're living in an increasingly secular world?
Yeah. Well, and also when you have a world that's growing more and more hostile to the church.
Right.
You think about it, used to pastors had a place of prominence in the community.
Yeah.
But then because pastors were sinful and did whatever they did, that kind of, you saw that. Churches used to be a place of comfort for folks. And now people don't come to church for that. They're not just going to show up at your door. And I think that's been part of the problem of just churches now just turning inward. And, one of the things you said is that because of COVID, a lot of the churches are now dying off. They're just ceasing to exist. And I don't necessarily see that as a good thing. I mean, a bad thing. I think it's a good thing so that there needs to be a sort of a refocus, lack of a better term, revival or revitalization of the Christian community so that we can be about the Father's business. And it's not going to be churches as usual. We're doing a study on Wednesday nights from Tom Rainier's book, The Post-Quarantine Church. And it's fascinating to see.
Good book.
Great book. And we just finished up the first two challenges. And we spent a month on technology because that's a big challenge for us. But I think the church is poised. I think the Christian community is poised to get the gospel out. Yeah. And it's just going to be, and I don't want this to sound arrogant or whatever, but it's going to be a pure form of the gospel.
Well, as somebody recently said, I can't remember who said it, that, when people are, gnashing their teeth and wringing their hands about the numbers going down, this person actually put a real positive spin on it. He goes, think of it this way. The ones that are remaining are the most devout, godly people out there. And so you're getting back to a core that is like a new platform, kind of like what you're saying, a new revival, a new, because you're shedding maybe some of the obligatory church attendees, and you're getting to the ones that really want to make it work and make it grow and spread the word and all the things that we want to do.
Yeah, you lose your baggage, and that's always a good thing. And I think it's just a sifting time right now. And, one of the things when I was preaching yesterday, I was talking about how one of the things that transition times like we're in right now with COVID and the church being what it is that it really shows you the depth or the lack thereof of your faith. Because if your number one question is why is this happening? Why is it happening to me? You're missing the whole boat here. And God doesn't mind a why question. He can handle our whys, but he wants us to go deeper than a why, because a why is pretty much, it's about us, and the gospel isn't about us. It's about him and then what he's done in us. So everything's got to point back to him. It's got to flow through him, or really we're just, building our own selves up.
Yeah. I mean, going back to what we were saying, I was recently talking with somebody doing an interview like this, and we were talking about, it was actually with Scott Hoffman, who's with the Billy Graham organization. He works, he's the director of strategic partnerships and works very closely with Will Graham. And, he was saying, we were talking about, the miraculous stuff happening in the Middle East, and how, amongst this, probably the most anti-Christian part of the world, miraculous things are happening. And then then I think either he or somebody else recently said, you want to put this thing in perspective, realize that either now or very soon, China will be the largest Christian nation.
Right.
Not as a percentage, but because they have 1.6 billion people, the number of Christians or people coming to Christ and becoming Christians is going to surpass any single other country very quickly, which is amazing.
They can't have buildings. They can't have the Bible. They can't talk about Jesus, yet the gospel is flourishing. And so we've had it so easy in America because we've had the freedoms, and those are being eroded away. And we shouldn't wring our hands and say, well, oh my, what are we going to do now? We should say, thank God, because now we have the opportunity to just speak the truth of the gospel to people.
Yeah. Oh, I think you used a really important word, that we've been comfortable, and I think there's definitely a lot of agreement that, as a society gets fat and happy, we get neglectful of the core values, and that's happened throughout history, and you get off track. And I think just to some great extent, I think that's what's happened, is we take things for granted, and we think there'll always be peace and prosperity and happiness and joy. And when COVID hit, I actually saw a few things, people that were, I don't know, they weren't aggressive atheists, like the ones that like to argue. I guess they may be more agnostic than anything else. But they actually reached out to me and said, for the first time in years, I prayed.
Wow.
I took a lot of joy in that there's still something inside, even those biggest doubters, that they're holding out some bit of hope, that God is out there listening to that prayer. So,
I mean, I believe that all people, what was that Augustine said, we all have that sort of God-shaped vacuum. And I believe that every human being has it because of the fall. And we don't know how to scratch that itch necessarily, but it's always there. I can't believe that anybody, when they lay their head on the pillow at night and say, there is no God, in the back of their mind going, do I really believe that? They might project it, but I think in the deep recesses of their mind, they know there's something that's missing in their lives.
Well, I think a lot of it has gone towards the way our society has been, which to some great extent, it decreases accountability. And so if you believe in a God, and you believe in the New Testament Jesus that we believe in, there's a whole lot of accountability. And you have to look at the world differently if you believe this story. And I think for some, it's a lot easier to say, I'm a good person,
Right.
and the only question I ask is, how can you prove that? And if you're setting the rules, can't you just change the rules based on your behavior if you cross your own line? But if you have a greater accountability, you don't have the ability to move that line.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's what Paul said too. He said it's the grace of God that keeps us from sin. Mm-hmm. It's not the rule, it's the grace of God. And so if we truly have the Spirit of God living within us, and the Spirit is always talking to us and encouraging, and our minds are being renewed, then our lives should be different than that other person. Not because we're towing a line or we're moralistic, but because the Spirit of God is leading us in a direction that's different than the way society goes.
Right. Yeah. Back to Frank Webster. He was.
Oh, please not.
He was. I know. I'm insufferable, and I don't want to listen to him either. But he was actually my first interview for this channel, and we talked about something that I always find amusing. It was one of his sermons, and you may even be familiar with it. You might have heard this, that he titled "The Pickle." And the whole concept was, an analogy of how, with a pickle, you're taking a cucumber, and the brine, it changes the very essence and makeup of it. So it can never go back to being a cucumber ever again. It is a different thing. And the analogy is obvious that, once you've fully accepted Jesus into your heart, you are a changed person. Your outlook and your behavior and the way you view your fellow man, it all just changes.
Yeah, the old is gone, the
I
new
hope that
has
wasn't
come.
too loud when I clapped, but yeah, but I love that story and that sermon that he preached, because I think it's something people could wrap their head around.
I have to use that analogy. I need to call him and get a better clarification. He needs to send it to me, because that's a good one.
He has a copy.
Okay, good. But but that's a good analogy, because we are different. It's not I know we talk about the Christian worldview, but being a Christian isn't a view.
No,
it's a substantive change to our whole being. And it's not just saying that, I'm going to be moral because I'm a Christian or whatever. It's saying I'm going to be Christ. You know what I'm saying? I'm going to be who he is as I live out my life every day. Yeah. And it's just different way to live your life.
Yeah. So kind of the last subject I wanted to get into, which I guess probably is more where your counseling is the area of pre-marriage counseling.
Yeah.
I've seen some stats. Some of them are really interesting, that younger people both anticipate and expect to be married, which it was a high number. It was like 86% of Americans over 18 say all couples can. Oh no, that's something else. But I read it somewhere that there's a high number, 70s or 80%, that they expect to, which,
yeah.
But then, there's the other statistics that without good pre-marriage counseling, where expectations and understanding and the rates, are what they are. What is our country, 50% or more, but then the numbers do improve as good counseling, both before and during. There's nothing wrong with even having counseling as a healthy marriage, to make sure you're checking in and being accountable. And it's hard to judge yourself. Sometimes you need a third party to be a mirror for you. And so, I mean, maybe you could just dig into some of those kinds of ideas of what you see.
Well, yeah, I do a lot of premarital counseling, and one of the things that in the statistic you gave, that over 80% expect to be married, the difference between from a generational standpoint is that they're waiting longer to get married.
Yeah.
So where instead of the early 20s, mid 20s, now it's late 20s and beyond. Yeah. They want to get established in careers. They want to do all this sort of stuff before they do get married. That makes them, one, more mature. So they're more open to listening to a counselor, because what I found, the younger the couple, the harder it is to do good counseling work with them, because they have the rose-colored glasses on.
And limited life experience.
Yeah. And so they think life is just always going to be great, because I got the love of my life, and they don't anticipate the rough patch. But what I use for premarital counseling is the best thing that I've used ever. And my graduate work is in family systems theory. Mm-hmm. And that basically says that we are who we are because of the system in which we were raised, the genetics, the socialization, the nature, nurture, all of that. Mm-hmm. For the first 25, 28 years of my counseling, I used a thing called, it was Getting Ready for Marriage. It was based on the genogram, and that's a family tree. You'd go back 3 generations, and you would work through the whole system. Yep. Well, and then after that, it was like 8 sections of about 75 questions, and they were all yes/no questions, and they would answer. Well, about two years or so ago, I ran across Les and Leslie Parrott's Getting Ready for Marriage. It's called SYMBIS. Save your marriage before it starts. And so I use that now, and that is absolutely beautiful. It's a system perspective, but they fill everything out online, and then you, as the counselor, you receive their report back. And it goes into so many different areas, every area of their life. And then as you go through the counseling, you give them the pages of what you've talked about, and they can begin to see it. It goes into their personalities, how different they are, their expectations, their wants, their needs, their desires, how they're made, how they view life. I mean, it just goes into everything, and I love it. I've done it with a number of couples, and they learn so much, and I get to learn about them too, because I read the reports. You know, I have to prepare to meet with them to talk about who they are. And so you can't do anything there's no such thing as foolproof, right?
Right.
I mean, so like the statistic is that 50% of marriages end in divorce is really sort of a misnomer in a way. It's 50% of a given year. Mm-hmm. But you extrapolate that out, the divorce rate isn't quite that high, but the divorce rate is as high for Christians as non-Christians. There's no discernible difference or no statistical difference, you know what I'm saying, or significance in that. And so the couples who will actually come and talk to you, who are serious about having a good marriage, a strong marriage, then those are the ones who will. Mm-hmm. It's the ones who either want engage with you in it or just do it to get it out of the way, or because maybe they feel pressured or whatever. They're not going to do anything. They're not going to learn from it. And so I've been doing it so long now, over 30 years, that I can tell right away what the couple's how they're going to respond. And I have to admit, the more they want to get out of it, the more I put into it. And if I see a couple's just not interested, I'm not so interested, you know, because I know they're not going to hear. I give them good stuff, but I know they're not going to apply.
Yeah, it kind of saps the enthusiasm from your side. If they're only there by obligation or what have you, then, you know, but actually I knew that you did SYMBIS because I looked at your website, and so I did a little searching around. Actually, I saw that stat when I saw it on some website to do with SYMBIS. It was 87% expect to be married. But the other thing that jumped out at me was it was just a bullet. And it said couples who do not receive pre-marriage education are more likely to see their problems as atypical and unsolvable. Mm-hmm. You know, it to me, that's the key is, you know, by working with them to show them where the potential pitfalls might be, and to talk through them. How are you going to handle this as a couple and as parents and whatever the circumstance, you know? But if they go in it without that thought process, they're going to think it's only them, and then comes self-blame and blaming each other, and because they hadn't prepared emotionally or mentally, spiritually for that occurrence. Well, most of the time, it's not going to be them looking at themselves. The blame is going to be toward their partner. Right. Because it's never my fault. You know what I'm saying? I'm perfect. That's exactly right. It's always the other person's fault. And so they do come into it with unrealistic expectations. And one of the things that I do with couples is teach them how to have a fight, how to have an argument, you know, how to be fair when you argue. And when you say, I forgive you, to make sure that you really have, and it doesn't roll back up. But in the SYMBIS program, what they do is there's homework that the couple does, and you have them work on certain things and then come back with you and talk through how they do that. And then you help them to better communicate, to see things from another person's perspective. Because as you said, I mean, we all have blinders on, right? We come from different backgrounds, different scenarios. We've been raised differently, different genetic makeups. And so we see the world a certain way. And when we're with somebody who sees it a different way, we always think our way is the best. And so that's where the tension comes in. And that's why couples, if they go through premarital work, they recognize that we're both flawed. We both see the world from a skewed perspective. So how can we work on this together? And I always tell them it's better together than on your own, because you're together, you're one. So work on it as one. And when sometimes I tell people, like, if you're going to have an argument, let's say something created an argument within your relationship.
look on that thing that created the argument as something that is trying to infringe on the peace and happiness of your relationship.
Yeah, contagion.
Yes. So instead of sitting on both sides of the table and fighting it out, put it symbolically in the middle, in the table, and you both sit side by side and talk about how we can stop this from eroding and deteriorating our relationship.
Wow.
Then it's not about you've got a problem or I have a problem. It's we have a problem. And it's that contagion that's trying to wreak havoc on us. How can we solve that problem?
I like that. That
Yeah,
could be used. That could be used in all circumstances. It's not just marriage. That, you know, you and I have a disagreement. We could do that. You know, that could happen in any relationship at all.
because what it does, it diffuses the emotion of it. It takes the blame out of it. And now, and then it's not easy to do because it takes a lot of time and might take months to do it, but you're working on it together. And so when you've accomplished defeating that, then then that strengthens the bonds of the relationship,
right?
Because you've done it together,
right?
So,
well, I think we've covered quite a lot, and our time is getting short. If I could ask you, one thing I like to do to end it is give you up to a minute or two to just share what's on your heart and tell people what's on your heart and mind, and maybe something they need to hear. So
well, I mean, like any pastor, this is Holy Week, so that is all over my mind because Easter's coming, and it's my title of my sermon this week is a tall tale, and I'm preaching out of Luke, and where he says the women went to the tomb, and he comes and they're telling what happened, and Peter in essence says, well, that was a pretty tall tale, I don't know if that's true or not, and so I think that because it's Holy Week, because the whole passion of what Jesus went through, the suffering and all of that, we've a message to tell. And Sunday is when more people in the world will hear it, because people still do go to church on Easter, or they're going to check in on Easter. And so for me, I'm excited about the opportunity to share the simplicity of the gospel with people. And we'll have a good in-person crowd. We're going to be dedicating my granddaughter, who's 8 months Sunday. Well, she's 8 months now, but they wanted to do that this Sunday. And so I'm excited about that. I'm excited about preaching. I'm excited about just being present with people again, more and more. So that's really the only thing on my mind right now. Check with me next week, and I'll be good weather and warm days will be on my mind because I can get my golf clubs out of the closet.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and your 7-iron.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I thank you for that. Easter is it's probably the most important day in our calendar. A lot of times Christmas is put up there, but I think Easter is the real miracle of that proves what we believe in. And
well, if you think about it, Friday, the crucifixion gave us forgiveness, but Sunday gives us life. Without the resurrection, we're just forgiven people. But with the resurrection, we're forgiven people who've been given new life. And
yep. And without the resurrection, we don't have a religion. We don't really have anything that says, other than he was another prophet that they put on the cross. Without that resurrection, we don't have Christianity as we know it.
No, and if we don't have the resurrection, all we do have is religion.
Right.
Because you can make that anything you want, but if you have a resurrection, then you have Christ, and that's so different. That supersedes everything. That crosses over every line.
As they say, that was a game changer.
That's right.
But I deeply appreciate you spending some time. My hope with this channel is by having people like yourself that have important things to say, that it'll touch even just a few, that might help them to change the way they're going, or seek help or whatever it is that they need in their life. That as we talked about, it's technology, so you never know who's going to be seeing or hearing, and if you touch one, you've done your job. So
Really.
that's my hope. So I appreciate your spending time with us.
Well, Rich, however you want me to call you.
Rich is fine.
Yeah, but it is good to meet you. Glad to know we have a great mutual friend in Frank, and I really enjoyed our time together. Hope we can do it again.
When COVID's over, Frank and I are threatening to come down to Memphis to see you.
Good. We'll eat some barbecue.
That sounds good to me.
All right, buddy.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.